Okay, everyone. I'm not going to use the microphone, but hopefully everyone can hear me. Yeah, it's a pleasure to introduce Seth today from the National Park Service at University of California. So Seth is bachelor's at Stanford University and his PhD at University of California, Davis. And Seth is a wildlife ecologist and the wildlife branch chief at the National Park Service for the Santa Monica Mountains National Recreation Area in Southern California, just west of Los Angeles. And Seth has a really cool and unique, I think, urban wildlife research. Tell you all about today, so I won't waste his time talking about it too much. But yeah, it's some exciting stuff with a bunch of different types. I got to know Seth. I did a postdoc with Seth, mostly working on the mountain lion research that he leads up, and I'm sure he'll show you a bit about that today. Some pretty cool stuff. And yeah, we've got this running on Zoom. Those of you tuning in by Zoom, I just ask you to please keep your sound off during the presentation, but you're welcome to put questions into the chat. And at the end, we'll read those to Seth, and we'll also take questions from the in-person audience. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to Seth.
Okay, great. Thanks a lot, John. And thanks for having me. It's my first time on LinkedIn, and it's great to be here and see people and see their stuff. So as John said, I'm going to talk about work that we've done at the National Park Service in Southern California on wildlife over the last more than 20 years. So I'm going to talk a little bit about sort of the general condition and what's going on sort of in terms of the status of the overall condition, the status of a bunch of different groups of animals, as John said, and then we've been lucky enough to do this work for, as I said, for more than 20 years. So I'll talk a little bit about what are some things that we've learned from being able to do long-term studies in this area. And then I'll talk a little bit too about what can we do. Mostly we do science, and we do some things originally here and there that we've been able to do, hopefully to actually make a difference for conservation. So just to situate us quickly, so this is where we are here in California, and it's one of 5 Mediterranean ecosystems on the planet, so somewhat unique in that way. And then in California Pacific Province, it's a biodiversity hotspot, huge amount of diversity, although only, and actually something I saw more recently said maybe about a quarter of the natural area is left. So a lot of diversity, but there's definitely some challenges. This is from one of the high spots in the Santa Monica Mountains, so just what the landscape looks like. And we do have a pretty amazing diversity of plants and other things as well, but I work specifically on vertebrates, so there's a few of the species, and so we're lucky to have a lot of diversity there in terms of all kinds of different taxa. So there are places like this in the Santa Monica Mountains where you can go and have no idea that you're next to Los Angeles. So this is in the Seawee Hills, an area that I'll talk about in a second, where you can have dense development and then little bits of remaining open space, and then more development and then more habitat. So some pretty highly fragmented areas. So here it is. This is Los Angeles here in the Pacific Ocean, and here's the Santa Monica Mountains. And you can see they're completely cut off from everything to the north by a major freeway here, the 101, which we'll talk more about. Then we have the Seawee Hills to the north, and then there's another freeway here. And then we have some areas of intense. Again, you have these little bits of natural area with roads and development in between. So it's a challenging landscape for all kinds of wildlife. And so here's some nice natural habitat in the Santa Monica Mountains with downtown Los Angeles in the background. And our job in all the national parks is to do our best to preserve the resources of those parks for future generations. But being in the second largest metropolitan area in the country, we have some different challenges than you might have at Yellowstone or Yosemite or someplace like that. And so all the work we do, and we've been working on a number of different groups, and I'm going to talk today about carnivores and reptiles and amphibians, is focused on understanding what are the impacts of urbanization and fragmentation on these wildlife communities and populations. So a few different things, of course, that can happen. One is straight up just loss of habitat, just gone after development. And then some more subtle things like what happens when you have natural areas next to development, so the kind of development encroachment, and how does that affect natural areas and populations and this. You can have small patches and slightly larger patches. So that can certainly have an effect. And then you have straight up habitat alteration, lots of streams and even rivers in Southern California end up looking like this. So I'm going to talk first about our work with reptiles and amphibians. So some of you may know that the national parks, for more than 20 years now, have a long-term inventory and monitoring program, and the goal is to pick what we call vital signs of ecosystem health, and then to monitor those as a plan. And for us, we picked reptiles and amphibians as a group to monitor because they're really diverse in Southern California, and there's a bunch of species that we're interested in and concerned about. So we do both aquatic and terrestrial herds. So we do stream surveys for amphibians. Basically, we get to go out every spring and mess around in the stream, which is pretty fun. And so we count tadpoles and we look for adults as well, of course. And then we also look for invasive species like this red swamp crayfish, which is actually from the southeast. And what we do is we characterize the streams, looking at, so here's the watershed above this stream location. You can see it's generally natural. So this is a very natural watershed. Then we have other watersheds like this. So here's a survey spot there, another one there, another one there. All of these, the watershed is highly urban, 25, 30, 35% of the watershed is urban. So we're interested in knowing how does that affect the streams. And basically the bottom line, the overall sort of condition is not good for the natural streams, and that as little as 8% of upstream development in the watershed can have a big impact on what the stream looks like and also what's in it. So one thing we do is we characterize the habitat by looking at pools and runs and ripples and looking at how long they are and how deep they are, et cetera. And so one of the things we see in these urban streams is much less diverse habitat structure. So these really long runs, like in this urban stream, very natural right there, but upstream in the watershed is highly urban. And then the other thing that really matters is in this Mediterranean climate, a lot of these streams get dry or almost totally dry 6 months of the year because we have no rain, basically from May through October. But in these urban streams, they stay wet year round because of runoff, and that's an issue where we have much more permanence of those streams. So what does that mean in terms of the amphibians? There's California newts here and California tree frogs. Much more common distribution-wise in these urban streams, in the natural streams, and very rarely in the urban streams. So these are species that are pretty sensitive to development. And then the flip side is true for these invasive species. So here's the red swamp crayfish, and they can just have a huge impact on everything, on the invertebrates, on the amphibians, everything. And you can see very common in the urban streams, and very rarely, fortunately, in the natural streams. And same thing with things like bass and bluegills that are also not native. I think that we have been able to do something, which is a pretty exciting project, I think, in terms of the amphibians, is we have been able to reintroduce a species that has been completely lost from the park, so California red-legged frogs. So California red-legged frogs are the biggest native frog in the West. They're actually the state amphibian now, and they're listed as threatened under the Federal Endangered Species Act. And there's a huge decrease in range over, sort of the last century or so, but this is what they were now. And in particular, they completely were lost in the Santa Monica Mountains by the middle of the last century. Last seen in the Santa Monicas in the mid-1970s. But there was one population discovered about 2000 in the Stevie Hills, so just north of 101 there. And so we started a project in 2013 together with Fish and Wildlife Service and state parks and other agencies to try to bring this species back to the park. So we looked at what streams might be suitable in terms of habitat, and then have egg masses from that population that was a pretty small population north of the freeway. We grew them up in pens, and then we've been monitoring them. So there were populations, historical populations throughout the Santa Monicas, but as I said, they hadn't been seen since the mid-70s. And so then this new population, this small little population in the Stevie Hills, we went and picked up egg masses. We brought them across the freeway, and we put them back in the Santa Monicas for the first time in, which was pretty exciting. This is what that looks like. So there's the egg masses. There's one of the pens here, one of these deep pools where we put them. So we grow them until they hatch, and then sorry, it's a little bit slow. Then when they're big enough to escape being eaten by the newt, basically, we put them back in the stream, and now we have red-legged frogs for the first time back in the Santa Monica, which I think is. And so then the other thing that happened, this happened within the first couple of years, we had metaphors when we had adults, but then starting in 2017, we actually had reproduction. And so this was our first egg mass where actually in these reintroduced populations, we started to have reproduction. And then we saw at the same time the actual mating, and you can see some of the red on these guys. So that was pretty exciting. And so overall, up through 2018, we did 2 stream sites at first, and then we increased that to 4. And lots of tadpoles released, and then we had reproduction actually first in just the one site and then in both sites by 2018. But then there's been some challenges, which I'll come back to at the end in the last couple of years. But an exciting project overall. So in terms of terrestrial Earth, we're also monitoring terrestrial reptiles and amphibians throughout the Santa Monica Mountains and the Simi Hills. But again, one of the things we're really interested in, again, is the impacts of urbanization and fragmentation. And we do this with pitfall trap arrays, so fencing, and then the pitfalls, and the animals come along and hit the fence and fall in the trap, like this alligator lizard or this whiptail lizard. All right, and then here we have what that landscape looks like. So we did this in these little small patches here, and then in large patches, and then in these large core areas. And the bottom line, sorry, it's a little hard to see, a little zoom thing here, but the bottom line is that fragmentation is bad for some terrestrial, especially for the larger species. So especially larger snakes like rattlesnakes and whiptails, you can see they're completely gone in these small habitat patches. We still get the large patches in the core areas, but they're gone from the small patches. But we do have some species like western fence lizards that are still throughout the landscape, from small patches to large patches to core areas. And so that's something that we were interested in, is what's going on with them. So I'll get back to in a second. But overall, we had lower diversity in the patches, a little bit higher in the large patches, and then highest in the core areas. And overall, we have a significant relationship here with species richness. So we had lower in the small patches and then higher in the larger areas. But one of the things we were interested in then is, what about for these species that are still across the landscape, like the fence lizards and a couple other species? Are we starting to see some evidence of genetic differentiation in these smaller vertebrates? They had a postdoc at UCLA who now works with us, who did this using the samples that we gotten from the pitfall trapping. So we did it for 3 lizards, western fence lizards, cyclops lizards, and skinks. And then she also did it for a bird, actually, red tits. And you would think, oh, birds are flying around, they're not going to be affected by fragmentation, but actually red tits are one of the species, if there were going to be a bird affected, it might be one that would be more likely because they're pretty habitat specific and not really one to fly over sort of big open areas. And so this is some of the results. I just wanted to say what this is a little bit. So this is this program structure. What we did is we put all of our genetic data into the program and asked it how many genetic clusters are there. And so in this case, there were 5 different clusters represented by these 5 colors. And then you can ask, well, are those associated with the geography? And you can see for the skinks, they very clearly are. So these couple patches are this red cluster, and then this one is this yellow cluster, and this one is the green cluster. And so very strong evidence of genetic over not that long, actually. And we saw the same thing for all 3 lizard species, and even for the bird, for the red tips. And then this is another program called Alleles in Space, where it measures where is the largest amount of genetic differentiation. And you can see for all 4 species, we saw the same pattern, basically, that the most intense differentiation was across the widest and oldest area of development here, which also included this freeway here. So important because we saw this significant genetic divergence. It was related to patch age and isolation, and also to the presence of roads and freeway. It didn't show the data, but we also saw decreased genetic variability for all 4 species. But in particular, we saw the same pattern for all 4 species, despite their being very different. So skinks are in a totally different family than cyclops lizards and fence lizards, and then fences are a bird, obviously. So a pretty strong pattern of fragmentation being with these smaller vertebrates. And then just the last thing is a little bit of the long-term perspective. Good news is that we still basically have all of the native species that we would expect to have in the park. So this is the park species list for reptiles and amphibians. There's 34 native species, 25 of which are basically terrestrial, and ones that you would likely find in, that will likely detect by pitfall traps. I'm going forward. Oh, there we go. Did you do that? Or did I? Okay.
I might have done that. If it doesn't work, you could try that. If it doesn't-
Okay, no, it's not. Sorry, so basically there are 25 species that are essentially terrestrial that we would likely, hopefully get in the park. And just in the first 8 years of that work, we got 24 of those 25 potential species, so all these different ones here. The only species we didn't detect was the lyre snake, which really likes rocky areas where it's very hard to put a pitfall trap, and actually just through anecdotal observations, we know that we still have lyre snakes. So that's a good thing, and these are some of those species. I was originally interested in animals because of snakes, gratuitous cool herb pictures, but we have horn lizards, which are one of the coolest animals out there, I think, and a royal salamander, a patsman snake. This is a California mountain king snake, actually, which unfortunately gets collected a lot because it's so interesting, and people are really interested in picking them up. But one thing, just last thing I want to mention is that these small patches, even though they have reduced diversity, they still have conservation value. So if you add up all the species in all those small patches in the area, they're actually quite a bit less area in terms of, like, if you were thinking about conservation dollars than one of these large patches, but they have a similar amount of habitat, of species, and so they certainly do have some conservation value. Okay, so now I'm going to talk about carnivores, and actually we've been doing carnivores for the longest time, back since '96. And the reason we started studying carnivores is because, of course, they need a huge amount of space, and so there's a group that's going to be affected by urbanization and fragmentation. Carnivores are going to be high on the list. We've been studying all these guys, especially bobcats and mountain lions, which we'll talk about today, and then coyotes as well, and a little bit gray foxes. But mostly I'll talk about bobcats and mountain lions. So we've been doing this work, as I said, for about 25 years, trying to understand how are carnivores affected by urbanization and fragmentation, looking at a bunch of different aspects of their ecology and conservation. So how urban are they? What are their home uses like? How are they moving across the landscape? What are core and what are barriers to movement? How are they surviving? And then what are they dying from when they don't? What are they eating? Are they able to disperse? Are they able to reproduce? And then how are they affected by disease and toxicants? So we've looked at all of these things over the last 25 years. And then we've been studying bobcats, as I said, for the longest. We're getting close to 400 bobcats handled, and then we've created quite a few of them. One of the things we're interested in, as I said, is how urban are these? So we do that as urban association. So we characterize here, dark green is natural, gray is urban, and then this light green is what we call altered open areas. So there's a landfill here, and then golf courses and low density residential areas. So this is what those natural areas look like. Again, far from development. But then here's the Calabasas landfill. So not exactly pavement, right, but not exactly natural, regular vegetation either. And then here's one of these gated communities. So you have this development. There's natural area in between, and some of it is even relatively native. So how is that affecting carnivores, and how are they using that landscape? So again, the overall sort of condition or status of the bobcats are somewhat sensitive to urbanization, and that's especially true for females. So here you can see a bunch of female home ranges that are blue here, and they're basically entirely within the natural areas here, within the natural patches, and then the orange and red ones are male, so they're bigger. So both in bobcats and lions, the males have bigger ranges, and the urban areas more. So and this matters because females, as in most mammals, are the ones that are doing all the taking care of the offspring, and so females are more sensitive to urbanization. You know, that's something that you might be concerned about. This is what those data look like. This is from the first 5 years of this bobcat study. So just looking at the percentage of the locations, the 23 locations that were urban, and you can see for adult males it was about 10%, but for adult females it was about 1%. So females really not using the urban areas. And then this is some more recent data now that we're using GPS collars. There's a female, you can see up to the freeway, but not across it, and not in development, and not even really in the landfill there. So one of the things that we've been able to do that's been pretty interesting, again, through this long-term work, is to look at reproduction in bobcats. So this is some telemetry data from early in the bobcat study. And about mid-February, we start getting the locations on the animals every day, especially on females. When they start to localize like this, then we can go in and track the female and find a den like this with the kittens here. This is actually interesting. This is something that we've actually seen a lot of bobcat dens in. This is a wood rat nest. So basically a big pile of sticks. And typically they're presumably kicking the wood rats out or eating them. But something that we see them denning quite a bit. I like this picture because it's an interesting, funny picture of how this felt about participating in our study. So one of the things, sort of general condition, but also something we're able to look at over the long term. So here was 10 years worth of reproductive data. And actually, sort of the good news here is we're seeing that about 2/3 of the females are reproducing both in the fragmented areas and in the natural area. So there doesn't seem to be a big difference in terms of how much reproduction is occurring sort of per female. In general, as I said, the females natural areas here, you see different females with their dens. But we do have some exceptions, which are sometimes some of the interesting cases. You can see these couple of females in this spot here where there was a den site. Wouldn't necessarily expect this to be ideal some bobcat denning habitat, but we had one female 3 different years in a row, and her daughter actually 2 years in a row den between the back of this condo and the back of that condo, including one time in this honeysuckle bush. And there's a couple of, these are some of the best bobcat pictures we have, taken not by us, but by the homeowners. So there's a couple of kids there, and there you can see the female in the fence there. So they were concerned a little bit, but we assured them that there was nothing to worry about with the bobcats. But overall, this is one of the things that's also been interesting to look at with our long-term data. So now we're looking at not just the first 10 years, but 16 years worth of data on reproduction. And again, for those first 13 years, you can see in general, the thirds of the females were reproducing, just like I showed in the previous slide, comparing fragmented to unfragmented. But in these 3 years here, 2012 to 2014, you can see the average went down to 7%, and 2 of those years we had 0% reproduction in these females. And one of the things you may know, we were in the middle, and actually we're in another one now, but in the middle of a huge drought that didn't break until about 2017. And so one of the things we don't have data, unfortunately, would be super interesting, but on rabbits, which are their main prey in that same area, but we think potentially if rabbit populations were down, then that could have led to lower reproduction of bobcats. The other thing I want to talk about with bobcats is some of the disease and toxicant results. So this is again something we've been able to look at over the long term, and in particular, we've been looking at rodenticide exposure, so exposure of carnivores, including bobcats, coyotes, and mountain lions. I'm just going to really talk today mostly about bobcats, except for this slide, but these are toxicants that people put out to kill rodents, and they end up in the wildlife, basically in the carnivores and the raptors, but we don't have the raptor data. So here's a coyote from our study, and you can see, so this is not where he died. He actually died out in the middle of the park. We picked him up and brought him back, and he had bled to death internally, and that's what happens with these rodenticides. They cause them not to be able to clot, and then they bleed to death. And so overall, this was a major cause of mortality in our coyote study over the 9 years of that study. So the second most common source of mortality after injury by cars. And overall, 83% of the coyotes that we tested were positive. So we were seeing this as a source of mortality. We see it as a mortality source in mountain lions too. We basically never see, we've had one, we had a couple of cases, one just again more recently, over 25 years, of them actually dying from that bleeding. But one of the things that we saw that was pretty interesting starting at the very end of 2001, early 2002, is a lot of mortality in bobcats from a disease caused by this mite here, specifically notoinkrid mange. And this is something we had never seen before in the first 7 years, and I did my dissertation on bobcats in the area, and we hadn't seen it there either. Had a big impact on the population. So here's 10 years worth of survival data. And you can see the first 5 years, so these numbers, right? So 0.83 means that's an 83% chance of a collared bobcat surviving from 1 year to the next. And you can see that about 75% survival for those first 5 years, but then the mange deaths started 1 in 2001 and 9 in 2002, and the survival rate dropped down to 50% and then down to under 30% in a couple of years. And we can see that on the landscape too. So this, right, as we were studying bobcats, we had 6 animals that we were collared. At one point, 5 of those 6 died within about a year or so of mange, and then the 6th one we lost track of. And then this is just another way that we saw that. So this is the number of scats that we were collecting, first for a diet study, but then just to get an idea of where bobcats were across the landscape. And you can see as mange deaths increased, that number just fell off the table in terms of how much we were seeing bobcats across the landscape. And so for those first few cases of mange, we took them all into the state lab to do a full necropsy. We basically found that all of those bobcats were exposed to the same rodenticide, but we had mortality in coyotes. And so the vet there actually suggested to us maybe they're being compromised in some way, and that makes them more likely to die, to get bad mange, and to die from it. And we have seen actually that there is certainly strong statistical evidence for that. So here, 22 out of the 26 animals that died of mange had a relatively high level, at least 0.05 parts per million of these rodenticides, whereas just 9 of 21 did, and this is highly significant statistically. So we were seeing numerically that there was a strong association. But then I had a grad student at UCLA who actually looked back over a whole bunch of years and collected animals in more different areas, and then she did these immune assays on bobcats, which was a big challenge because people have rarely done them on anything other than humans before. But she found significant immune effects relative to whether or not, so both inflammatory responses and immune suppression responses. And in terms of the inflammation, one of the things that she found was there are a bunch of cytokines, which are cell signaling proteins that were associated with immune suppression. I think since the pandemic was the first time since this work that I had ever heard about cytokines. Anyway, she found that a number of these different cytokines were more expressed in animals that were exposed to the toxicants with the here. And then these ones with the arrows are ones that are classically involved in an inflammatory response. And so one of the things that we think one might be going on is, so typically the cytokines help the immune system target a particular infection. But if you get a whole bunch of different cytokines cranked up at one time because you're exposed to some other outside thing like rodenticide, then that might make it harder for the immune system to fight the infection. And then we've actually had another grad student looked even more detail, looked at actually at gene expression, so using RNA techniques, and found that there was significantly different gene expression in animals that were exposed to rodenticides than animals that weren't. And in particular, there were genes associated with the immune response, with skin integrity, and then with trying to metabolize exotic compounds. And then how is this affecting, sort of going back to some of what we can see, same habitat patch that I showed you before. So this is lots of different bobcats in there for mange, as I said. They basically all died of mange, and for a long time we saw no, basically a male would pass through here and there, but no females and no reproduction. And then about 10 years later, we started to see bobcats come back, and we started to see females in there again. Unfortunately, in recent years, we're starting to see mange come back again a little bit more. So that's unfortunate, but interesting. So what can we do in terms of this? That we can really do specifically, but that more that other people have done. So lots of people have used our data as some of the reasons why to change how much anticoagulant rodenticide use is occurring on lots of different levels. So sometimes even at individual stores and local jurisdictions like those whole counties where on county land they're not using especially second generation compounds, which are the longest lasting and most poisonous. And then statewide, regulations changed their regulations in 2014, and then the EPA actually had done the same thing a few years earlier. So there have been some significant changes, although I'm not going to show the mountain data, but we are still continuing to get tons of exposure and including deaths in the mountain. So these things haven't necessarily stopped the exposure. So I'm also, the other specific species I want to talk about is mountain lions. I'd like to show this picture because this is a mountain lion and this. And that seems obvious, right? But you would be, or maybe you wouldn't be surprised about how many sightings we get that turn out, that people say are mountain lions, that turn out to be bobcats. Obviously, bobcat with a shorter tail hair and a nice facial ruff and the spotting, although the spotting can be quite variable. But we do have mountain lions, and they're been a super interesting species that we've been studying. Sorry, this is a little block here, but we've been studying them from 2002 to 2021, so 19 years now. 99 mountain lions, so we're just about to feed 100. But one thing you notice is we're at about 100 mountain lions and about 400 bobcats in a slightly different period of time, but mountain lions are just very low density on the landscape. And so that's one of the big challenges with them. This is actually our most famous mountain lion, P22, who lives in Griffith Park. This is a National Geographic photo that Steve Winter was able to get all the time in the background there. But with the mountain lions, so bobcat study area, mostly that I was talking about was in the Seawee Hills here, and then in the northern Santa Monica's. But this entire region is really the study area for the mountain lions. And we figured from the beginning that the Santa Monica Mountains might not be big enough for a viable population, and so connectivity between the Santa Monicas and the Seawee Hills, across 101, the Seawee Hills and the Santa Susana, across 19, and now all the way up to Los Padres, where we're confident that there's a nice source population up there. And that's exactly what we've seen through our study. So this is just even from the very beginning. So the first 4 mountain lions, there you can see P1 using the entire, this is an adult male using the entire Santa Monicas by himself. And then here's a female. And as with bobcats, the female hominins are quite a bit smaller than the males. But you can imagine there might be room.
Did I screw you up?
No, it doesn't want to go forward. There we go. So you can imagine there's a female here in the west end of the Santa Monicas, and then maybe another female here in the east end, and then sometimes females will overlap with their close relatives, like their daughters or their sisters, and so maybe we have room for about 6 females in the Santa Monicas, and then sometimes we might have 2 males instead of just 1 male. But either way, you're talking about less than a dozen animals in the Santa Monicas by themselves, and that's just not enough in the long run for a viable population, demographically or especially genetically. So that's one of the things that we've been looking at. So what about this connectivity question? To what extent are mountain lions able to get back and forth across some of these roads? So this is 118 to the north between the Seawee Hills and the Santa Susanas, and we have seen a fair amount of movement back and forth across that road. We had this, here you can see some of these tracks for a couple of these animals, and this one young male actually P3. So there he is, and there's a you can see his collar and some graffiti on the bottom of this tunnel. There's a nice equestrian tunnel under 118 here, and he probably used that every single time that he crossed back and forth. So for that freeway, we do have some movement, but in general, and especially for the most important one, 101, we have very little. So here's some early data from P2, that first female coming right up to the freeway, and then we're relatively close to it, and then turning around. This is what she would have been looking at. This is the Liberty Canyon area, which I'll come back to a little bit later. But if she was going to have crossed, she would have to come down, navigate around the house building, and then unless she went over the freeway, and potentially go underneath the freeway here at Liberty Canyon Road. And in general, we see that this freeway, so here's many thousands of points from the mountain lions in the Santa Monicas and in the Seawee Hills. And you can see here at the western end of the Santa Monicas, lots of points right up to the freeway, but not across. Same thing in the center, and actually in the east end of the Santa Monicas along the San Fernando Valley, there's so much development, they don't even get close to the freeway. So we've seen very little movement across the same thing for 5. So here's a bunch of animals coming up right up to 5 and not going east of it. And then same thing for 405. This is in the eastern end of the Santa Monicas. Lots of different animals, and even more so now right up to the freeway, but it's almost never crossing it. So what does that mean? There's sort of 2. So this is again some of these long-term things we were able to study by doing this work over such a long time. 2 major problems with mountain lions not crossing the freeways, especially 101. I'll start with this one: very low dispersal into the Santa Monicas, and it's a small population to begin with. Means that we're getting low genetic diversity. And then very low dispersal out of the Santa Monicas leads to a couple of different things in terms of increased social interactions, we think, relative to if there was more movement, because if there was less development in the roads, basically between young animals and adult males. So for males, especially some adult males, that leads to fatal fights between adult males and these younger animals. It's considered conflict. And for females, we see mating between very close relatives, And this very close inbreeding along with the small population size leads to low genetic diversity. And that's exactly what we've seen. So in terms of the dispersal of young males, so in general in mountain lion populations, all the young males dispersed to try to find a new territory, and half of the young females even will generally disperse. And of 23 young males that we know of, not a single one has successfully dispersed to a new home range outside the Santa Monicas. I mean, so P22, who ended up in Griffith Park, we're pretty confident that he came from the Santa Monicas, but he's in Griffith Park by himself with no mating opportunities. So not really sort of a successful dispersal in that sense. And then of the 18 animals with known final results, 14 died before during dispersal. This should be before actually. Anyway, you would say that, but we had some that died on roads. One that was killed in Santa Monica actually when he wandered out along the promenade there. The most common source of mortality for these young males has been other adult males killing them in these fights. And so we also have mortality from vehicles, and actually, I'm not going to show the data, but a bunch of animals that have died directly from our deaths and poisoning as well. So we think, and actually, with the interspecific conflict, 5 young males, a couple of kittens, but also 2 females, including 1 adult female, where the male killed a female that he had previously mated with, which seems like a bad strategy, right? So, and again, we think these interactions, which they certainly can occur, especially in unhunted populations, we think they're exacerbated by the fact that these young males and even these young females typically can't disperse. This is what dispersal should look like here in the Santa Susana Mountains, right? So here's a young male in the Santa Susanas, and he dispersed out along the 126 in the Santa Clara River. Actually, we have a few appears to be being chased by his father, and then he was able to cross 126 here, disperse up here into Los Padres, and find a home range here. Whereas animals in the Santa Monica, we've never had a single one successfully do that kind of thing. And then, as I said, with the females, we're seeing mating with very close relatives. So this is the first litter of kittens that we documented, P5, 6, 7, and 8. The parents were P1 and P2, and then P1, the father mated with P6, his daughter. That was very close inbreeding, having P13, and then P12 mated with P13 and had 17, 18, and 19, which that was a good thing, as I'll mention in a second, because P12 came from outside the Santa Monica, but then he mated with P19, his daughter, and had 23 and 24, and then he mated with P23, his granddaughter, and had 36 and 37. So for these two, P12 is their father, their grandfather, and their great grandfather. And they don't know that, we're presuming they're just out with whoever's around, basically, right? But that's obviously not a good thing from a genetic diversity point of view. And so we have seen a lot of genetic differentiation relative to the road. So this is that same program structure, but now with the mountain lion data. So we have 3 clusters here, and you can see that animals south of 101 in the Santa Monicas are very strongly in this green cluster here, and then north of 101 they're in this blue cluster, and then actually east of 5, so that other freeway in this red cluster. So this is what that looks like. So the green cluster in the Santa Monica, the blue one north of 101, and then the red one east of 5 there. So we've actually seen this work that we've done together with University of Wyoming and with UCLA in terms of the genetic work. But we saw significantly lower genetic diversity, a number of different measures of genetic diversity, heterozygosity and the locus, significantly higher north of the freeway. In fact, the Santa Monica's south of 101 had lower genetic diversity than had been seen anywhere else in California, similar to the Santa Anas, which are another isolated mountain range south of Los Angeles, and these two are both lower than all of the populations measured in other parts of the West. The only place in mountain lions that had lower genetic diversity was in Florida panthers, which virtually went extinct before 1995, largely because of inbreeding infection. So these are the mountain lions for the first 8 years. They're in the Santa Monicas, or a couple in the Simi Hills. But we did have this young male P12. We caught him in the Simi Hills in late 2008. And then in early 2009, he crossed over into the Santa Monicas, which was very exciting. And he did so right in that same Urbanization area that I mentioned before. And then the good thing was, not only did he cross over, but he survived, and he survived to breed. Right? Remember, the males are often fighting with each other. And this is P12. You can see he's very strongly in this blue. in this green cluster. And here's their offspring. So you can see they're a nice mix between that blue cluster and the green cluster. And then here's P23 and P24. Remember, for those, P12 is the father and the grandfather. And so they're actually about 75% associated with this blue cluster, which totally makes sense. And then this is some work that we did together with John. As you mentioned, he was a postdoc with us. And he did this really cool modeling work, looked at what might we see going forward in the future over the next 50 years. And he was able to look at a few different scenarios in terms of connectivity. So we looked at heterozygosity here. We looked at no immigration, and you can see heterozygosity continuing to decline at about the levels that we had seen with P12, so 1 every 12 years or so. You can see it declines, but not as much. But if you increase the connectivity just not all that much, immigration to 1 every 4 years and 1 every 2 years, then it really starts to level off, and importantly, doesn't get close to this red line. This red line is the level of genetic diversity that they were seeing in Florida panthers when they were seeing and when they were having these really serious inbreeding depression issues. Unfortunately, this is a very recent thing that we've seen. So in early 2020, we captured a young male PD1, and he had 2 things that we had never seen before. One is he only had 1 descended testicle. So 1 had not descended out of the body down into this. That's something that's called cryptorchidism. And that was something that they were seeing in 2/3 of the males in Florida before the genetic rescue. And then he also had this distinct tail kink at the distal end of his tail. And that was something that 90% of those Florida panther animals had. So that was something, and then we were able to see, this is some video that we got of him just before he was captured. But we got photos from that same area within a few days, actually, of an uncollared male after we caught him at a distal tail kink. And then we had another male that we had gotten photos of, and we looked back at some older photos and saw a distal tail kink for him. This is a male, an uncollared male that lives east of 405. And then we had actually more recently in the fall of 2020, we got photos of another animal in the Santa Susana Mountains, also with the distal tail kink. So overall, we had 4 animals in these 3 different areas with distal tail kink. So something that leads to increased urgency potentially to increase genetic diversity in this population. So what can we do about this? And this is something that's pretty exciting that we're doing right now, which is we are working with lots of different folks to put a wildlife crossing over 101. And this is something that people have done in other areas. So this is some very famous crossings here in Banff National Park. And this is one in Germany. What do you notice about these pictures though? And these roads here? There's no cars on them. So very little traffic in some of these places. And this is 3 lanes and this is the total of 4 lanes. So what we're doing with this project is pretty unique as far as we know. So we're planning to put it over 10 lanes of roadway and 8 lanes of traffic, and one of the busiest freeways literally on the planet with 350,000 vehicles per day. And it's going to be the first that we know of in the area, actually the second largest urban area in the US and one of the largest in the world. But it's pretty exciting. We're going to break ground actually in January on this project, and we're down to talking about, what kind of things are we going to plant on top and how are we going to monitor and stuff. So it's really going to be a reality. It's pretty exciting. So the last long-term thing that I want to talk about that we've been able to see because some of these effects, because we've been doing this work over a really long time, is the impacts of fires. So wildfires are huge. It's just part of the system in Southern California, but there have been much higher frequencies and then bigger fires in recent years, as you've probably heard. And so actually, we've had a few events since I've been there, but one in particular that I'm going to talk about. So here's a fire history map pre-2018. You see here's a Springs fire, which we did a little bit of work on, and then this the Japan, which I'll mention a little bit of. But the Green Meadows fire at 38,000 acres was this big fire that everyone talked about. It was the big conflagration that was famous for years. And then in November of 2018, we had the Woolsey fire, 96,000 acres. So the Green Meadows fire was 38,000. This one was 96,000, 2.5 times as big. And importantly, burned close to half of the natural area within Santa Monica, 42%, and actually in the Stevie Hills, like 2/3 of the natural area in Stevie Hill. So just a huge impact. And this is what it looked like after that fire, just total devastation and landscaping. And then here's another look at that. So here's a veg plot that our veg folks had, and this is pre-fire. And this is that exact same spot post-fire. So a huge fire with a huge impact. So how does that affect some of the groups that I've been talking about? And so just wanted to mention a few things about that. So this amphibians, the streams, and therefore amphibians can be especially impacted, not as much by the fire, but by the results the next winter when the rains come. So here's just got a huge amount of sedimentation with no vegetation left that flows into those streams. And we had seen this actually with an earlier fire, with the Topanga fire back in 2005. So here's one of our stream survey sites, and 55% of this watershed here burned. And so this is what the full depth, so this is the average full depth here. The fire was in the fall of 2005, just dropped off the table, and basically we just stopped seeing it in that stream after 2005. So this is the number of habitat sections basically where we were detecting nukes, and they were basically gone from that fire. And after that fire, and this is what that looked like. This is this huge 3 or 4 foot deep nuke pool where we were seeing tons of reproduction for years. It got filled with sediment, it got filled with cattails. And basically we just stopped seeing reproducing there. So what about with the red-legged frogs? So here's the fire perimeter here. And unfortunately, here's our source site for red-legged frogs, and here's our 4 streams where we put them back, and all that was within the fire perimeter. And so we saw exactly the same kind of things, unfortunately, in those stream sites that I was showing you. Right, spring of 2018, before the fire, this is where we had one of our pens, nice and cool. Sorry, there we go. And this is what it looks like post-fire. So just completely filled in with sediment. Obviously, no nice pool for putting a pen in, and here's one of these other sites in the spring of 2018. And here it is post. Huge impact on the streams. We did have one of our sites, the site that we first saw the reproduction in, was not as bad, and actually we have continued to see reproduction in 2019 post-fire and again the last 2 years. So we now have reproduction in that stream 5 years in a row, which is exciting. The other 3 sites, which were much more impacted, we have done nice surveys and there are still frogs there, which is a good thing, but the habitat is still very poor, although we have now done reproduction in all 4 of those reproduction sites. So that's pretty exciting. So what about the carnivores? So here's the Stevie Hills where we've been tracking bobcats. This is this young GPS point for this young male bobcat during the last few weeks before the fire. You can see he's heavily using this natural area. You can see he's not up here in this what we call this northwest lake area. So that's pre-fire. And then, oh yeah, just to show you what this in the Stevie Hills, just the same kind of just total devastation there. So that's post-fire. And then here that guy's point post-fire. So here it is pre-fire again, like I said, using the Westlake patch quite a bit. And then basically post-fire, just completely abandoned it. So he was very heavily in that northwest lake area that he had never used before. And then you can see a whole bunch of points right here, kind of on the burn perimeter, but that was actually just one little hillside that didn't get burned. So basically totally moving from using burned areas to not using them. And this is a female. We actually caught her the night before the fire, so we don't have too much pre-fire data, but we did get a remote camera photo of her, and we think that she was probably generally using the Westlake patch as well. And you can see these are post-fire points, and she's completely again not. This one little patch down here did not burn, and then she's actually using some of these developed areas a little more than most females do. And then we actually documented reproduction for her post-fire, so in the spring of 2019. But you can see here's her points when she was denning, and there's the kittens. And this was actually the first den that we ever documented in someone's backyard. But the backyard did not burn, right? So we think that may be a reason why she ended up made People magazine, which is the first time we'd ever been in that publication. And then here's another young male, and you can see that we call it after the fire actually, but again, just completely not using any of these burned areas and focused on the unburned here, and then actually using quite a bit of the developed areas which also did burn. Just one last interesting thing recently about the bobcats is we actually had a litter, the first litter in a couple of years, just this past April. There's 3 kittens here. And found that they den often in these wood rat nests, but the wood rat nests are big piles of sticks. So you can imagine how well they do with the fire. And so she actually denned in this limb of this tree, which was interesting. We think because there was a lot of dense brush and wood rat nests that just weren't around, but also it looked like a burn scar. And so in this case, the fire may have actually provided a potential den site that wouldn't have been there before. What about mountain lions and the fire? In general, species like bobcats and mountain lions, et cetera, we think are likely to be able to escape the fire itself and not die in it, but eventually be affected by not using burned areas as I was showing the bobcats. But we did have a couple of mountain lions that actually died directly related to the fire. So this is P74, here's the fire perimeter, and these are his points before the fire, and these are his points the day of the fire. And the last one we got was at 1 o'clock on that afternoon, and the fire came right here at 7 p.m. that evening. And this was fire right where his points were. This is a deer that actually did not make it out, and so we think it was a very fast-moving fire, as many of these ones are. I think that he probably just A, died in the fire, and B, the color just got burned up and stopped working as well. And then the other case is a little bit different. This is an adult male P64 who was really interested in this and figured out how to get back and forth across a couple of different freeways, including 101, using this long, dark culvert, which is the only line that's ever freeway. But what happened with him is he was up in the City Hills north of the freeway during the fire, and he moved down this way the night of the fire, came up against development in urban areas and probably all kinds of activity. You know, we can't read his mind, so we don't know for sure what he was thinking, but he turned around and went back right up over the recently burned area. And then these are his points post-fire here. 10 days later, and his paws had been badly burned, it was going right back over the fire. So it looked like he died basically from starvation. So that was him. So we did have a couple of animals that died relative to the fire, and then we had big impacts of the fire on the mountain lion movement as well. So here's the animals before the fire. You can see they're very heavily using the area within the perimeter of the fire, and then this is just the ones in Santa Monica pre-fire. And then here's right after the fire. Very little. A couple months later, for 3 months post-fire, and then here you can see actually there was one little patch, and you can see a little bit better here, that did not burn in the southeast corner of the overall fire perimeter. So one of our female P65 was heavily used in that corner there. And then here's 5 to 6 months post-fire, still very little use, as I said. And then just looking at a couple specific animals. So here's P56 pre-fire, and then here's the fire. See very little use post-fire. And then with P65, here's her points pre-fire. And you can see she was using the southeast corner, but a little more spread out. And then post-fire, she was really heavily focused on this one little patch within the overall perimeter that didn't burn. This is a whole year post-fire, and you can see again very little use for animals within the fire perimeter. But one thing that we've also been looking at recently is a bunch of overlap between males. So animals almost half the mountain, so they're more than the eastern end. And so you had a bunch of males over there potentially interacting and potentially having those kinds of fights that I talked about before. So that's another potential consequence. And this is 2 years after starting to see some more use of the fire, but again, this central burned area here still seeing very little use. And then just this last quick thing I want to mention, that's another thing I'm sure what can we do that I think is a cool story. We've been doing a lot of work with Caltrans, the state transportation agency, to look at different roads and look at mortality and connectivity along them. There's a bunch of different projects here, and we have some more going on coming up. But there's one project here along State Route 118 that was pretty interesting, where we studied a bunch of different culverts or potential crossing points that were totally useless for wildlife. So this one had this 10-foot drop structure here, and here you can see a big drop here, and this one was totally So Caltrans actually, after we did the study, we basically found that none of these crossing points were getting used at all. They went out and got some money, and we had recommended through federal highways a few different potential things that they could do. And so they got another grant. Here's a bobcat looking down that 10-foot tall wall, and it might have been able to jump down, but certainly wouldn't have been able to come back up. But they got this grant, and then we basically built some things, just some simple. So here's that 10-foot drop structure. Built a little ramp here. There's Caltrans and Justin, one of our biologists, and they've been incredibly successful. I just think it's a super cool thing. As a family of 5 raccoons, they started using them right away. There's this coyote that was using it actually the same time of day here, and then a couple of days later, and then a skunk and a bobcat and another family of raccoons here. So just one way that actually in this case we were able to use our fairly simple solutions that really made a difference. So just to wrap up, you can see we've studied a bunch of different types of wildlife in the stream. We're seeing that even as little as 10 or even 8% can have an impact, but we were able to bring back California red-legged frogs, which is exciting. With terrestrial herbs, we do have some species like big snake being lost, but we are maintaining, we've seen the genetic effect, but we're maintaining our overall diversity in the park, which is a good thing. Bobcats are certainly affected by urbanization, by these rodenticide poisons, although they are still reproducing, and then we've had some of these changes to the regulation, so we'll see what that does. And then for mountainlands, this lack of connectivity is leading to low genetic diversity, and we think because probably because there's some of these other things going on. But we have had some cross, and as I said, and as the work that we did with John showed, we don't need a huge number to cross to make a big difference genetically. And very soon we're going to be starting this overpass, which we're pretty excited about. So that's it. Thank you.
Yeah, so I think Morgan will take the microphone around if anyone has any questions in the in-person audience. And I don't know if they can hear me on Zoom, but I will read any questions on Zoom as well.
Thanks a lot. That was a great talk. And so much going on there. I guess my main question is about thinking about like management decision making. If this was all a big national wildlife refuge, you know, that people, managers, people and stuff. There's, I guess, it's like city councils and multiple.
There are a lot of players.
But like, I guess, what are the levers that they, I mean, they're thinking about all kinds of, you know, business, prosperity, and economic development.
Right.
Wildlife, stewardship, you know, there's zoning. You obviously provided examples of the transportation movement across transportation blockages. Are there other important things that urban managers can consider that are kind of behind the scenes impacting it?
Yeah, so are you, in terms of what are you talking about a particular problem, like the connectivity problems, or?
Well, I guess just the whole suite, really.
Yeah, so.
From an urban ecology standpoint.
Yeah, no, I think that's just, so I didn't talk about it because I thought, you know, you all aren't exactly right there, and so it might not be as meaningful, but yeah, there's a huge number of players involved, so, and I didn't show it actually, but that park, so most national parks, you go to the park and the Park Service owns it all. We own 1/6 of the land within our district boundary, and there's state parks which owns quite a bit, but altogether there's about half of it is not publicly owned. And there's 2 counties and lots of jurisdictions and stuff. So yeah, so it is complicated. You know, I will say with the with the rodenticide issue, it's been quite gratifying. I mean, it's not really our job, so it's because the Park Service is not a regulatory agency, right? So we just try to do whatever our piece of property is, but especially in this area where we have all these neighbors and we're studying outlines that go over huge areas, we have to work with all of those folks on a regular basis. And I think one thing that has happened from the connectivity point of view that was super exciting is the County of Ventura actually put together a ordinance specifically related to all that connectivity. And so we actually have worked with a bunch of partners to critical corridors connecting the Santa Monica's to other areas. And they took that map actually, and they said, okay, within these areas, not that you can't ever develop anything, but you have to do it in a way that has the least impacts on connectivity. So not put up, giant like stone beds and anything like wildlife, permeable fencing, and not, eliminating all the vegetation around the crossing point, sort of things like that. One thing we have done actually is also related to connectivity is, so we map those those linkages, but having a map on paper is very different than having conservation on the ground, right? So we actually put together this group called the linkage. Sort of affecting those things, and Nature Conservancy and other folks do that much more. But I think it's been really valuable, and it's another meeting, and whatever, we'll have maybe too many meetings, but at some point, that's what you really have to do, I think, is bring all those people together into the same room and be talking about those things. And I will say the city of Los Angeles, I didn't really talk about it at all, and not very with part of P22 is not much of the area we work is within the city, but the city of Los Angeles is starting to pay attention to these issues more and to think about wildlife connectivity and stuff too. So, and it's not an easy answer necessarily, but I think that's a big part of what you have to do. I mean, I think doing science is critical too, because that really makes a difference. Like the project manager on that Caltrans project, where he put those ramps on, he was basically like, if you didn't have that, we wouldn't have done it, and it seems obvious, right? Like clearly the wildlife can't get up to 10, what I mean? But that really, the pre-data, at least in that case, does really make a difference, which is gratifying, as a scientist.
Question folks who live in that area are very well.
Right.
Do you feel that helps with you kind of what you
Yeah, right.
I mean, a bit of an off-the-wall question, it's one thing in your experience that's benefit or a problem.
Right. No, that's a good question. So I'd say the answer is both. I'd say one thing about the people in this area and the state of California is big and diverse, and there's lots of different areas. So in Southern California, in general, people are very positive about wildlife, and so that's a good thing for us. That helps us, sort of do these things and get these things going. But we also do sometimes have that problem of not wanting us to come and do it like in their backyard. You know what I mean? So it can be somewhat of a challenge. Overall, it's critical that there has been, especially for a species like mountain lions, and this is the only big city that we know of where there's a big cat anywhere on the planet. And I think there's lots of places where they would be tolerated. So I think we're lucky to have people as positive about wildlife. And so, yes, there are some challenges where it makes it hard to do the work, but I think we'll have to take that.
Yeah, I was curious. The fire in Santa Monica, big fire that was Super Bowl.
The Woolsey fire.
Woolsey fire, yeah. That was some more recently, so 2019?
2018.
2018, okay. So I was curious, it seems to have taken a lot of viable habitat on that, but at least in the short term, not a change in the population numbers, so kind of forcing the same number of individuals into smaller areas. Especially when it comes to males. I was wondering if you guys had seen any behavioral modifications in the way that you use the landscape, either spatially or temporally, right? They're trying to avoid that big issue of considered conflict,
Right.
It might manifest itself.
Yeah.
In other ways.
I mean, so I didn't talk about it, but actually, we have been looking at that a little bit. So we have a postdoc at UCLA, where we've been looking specifically at sort of changes in behavior post-fire. We did see, I'm not sure I mentioned it just briefly, but we did see increased overlap between males in that eastern end of the Santa Monica fire. And you know, we saw a few other changes in behavior. And everyone was like, oh, they're going to all descend down into the urban areas and be everywhere. And that hasn't really happened. It increased a very small amount, but it went from 4% to 5%. You know what I mean? So it's not like they all. But we did see some things
like more use, more activity during the day, which could be something that could lead to more interactions with people, for example. And we did see sort of more road crossing behavior again, which could potentially, lead to mortality, and a little bit more just higher movement rates, which could potentially end up with more interactions between animals. But actually, we're going to do some other work with John, specifically looking at that question using step selection functions and some more detailed analysis, where we'll be able to look at how are animals sort of balancing these ideas of, well, for females and subadults in particular, like staying out of the way of males, but also, finding food and finding safe places and things like that. So it is something we want to look at more. But no, it's a good question. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
I'm sure it's easier said than done, so there are plans to connect the two different maps.
I'm not sure.
I think the first part of the question is saying, I think when trying to get support for the wildlife crossing, were they advertise all about mountain lions or for wildlife?
Right, yeah, and so definitely, I mean, that's a really good question. The mountain lions get the most attention, partly because they're sort of whatever the biggest and most charismatic, but also they are the most at risk, right? They're the smallest population, and we know that there are issues. But the bottom line is, we are building this crossing for everything, not just for mountain lions. I mean, for example, one species that we really want to get across is deer, which deer are often less willing to go through culverts, for example. And deer are the main prey for mountain lions, so we want to keep them going as well. But the truth is, we're building this crossing. That's probably why it's an overpass and it's vegetated, and we're trying to make it work for basically everything. We're trying to reconnect these systems, not just reconnect mountain lion populations. Like I said, so we've advertised it, and certainly whenever I talk about it for everything, not just for mountain lions. Yeah. And then what are the three populations in California that?
I think it was when you showed the
Across 5, yeah. So obviously, this crossing, we're trying to connect the Santa Monicas to the Simi Hills, although it's a really good question because we actually have a project that we're just about to do along 118. So I showed that we have had a couple animals go back and forth across 118, but unfortunately, we also had a female get hit and killed, like right near that crossing. She just didn't find the tunnel. And then 2 of her 5-month-old kittens were also killed within the same 3-week period. And one issue there, which I didn't really talk about, but is that there's basically no good fencing funneling animals to that crossing point. And so animals are just able to get on that freeway. And so we're actually about to do a project in that same spot because, and actually I didn't mention it, but this is like about an $80 million crossing, this crossing over 101. So it's a huge project. But we can spend all this money and build this big crossing, but if we don't protect the other areas to the north, it's really not helping us that much, right? So it's critical to think about those other places. For 5, actually, it's really interesting. So statewide, they've also seen, I mean, the genetic analysis that I showed was just for our region, but they've seen significant differences across 5 statewide as well. And we've never had an animal. We had one animal try to go across and get hit and killed on 5, actually. We've never had animals go back and forth across there. We've actually just been doing a study recently, and some of the smaller animals are getting back and forth, but not mountain lions. And so we're working on it. Unfortunately, 5, they're actually about to put in another lane in each direction right through that most critical area there. And we sort of didn't get to that project early enough. They basically, the consultants, what they said was, oh, it's already a big barrier, so it doesn't matter. It's not going to affect connectivity if we put in another couple lanes, basically. But it's kind of a potentially a big missed opportunity to try to make some difference with that road. But yes, I mean, the truth is, we're hoping this crossing is just the first of many, not just in California, but in all areas. I mean, you were talking about, you know, connectivity for the pronghorns. I mean, there's so many places, you know, where it's a big concern. So, yeah. Of course. Yeah, thank you.